Archaeology helps us to learn a lot about the ancient world. And most importantly, it gives us texts from the ancient world. And in those texts, such as this one, we get information about how people thought, how they lived. And in that sense, these texts give us a window to the ancient world. That's important to us because the Israelites lived in that world. The Bible was written in that world. God communicated his truth in that world. And so as we discover more about the ancient world through the literature that has been preserved, we can understand more about how people in that time thought that may be very different from the way that we think. And in that way, we can avoid imposing our own ideas as foreign ideas onto the text. So we need to think the way they thought. We've now laid a foundation. We've talked about the authority of the text, and we've talked about how that authority is connected to the ways we think about God and science and the Bible. So we're now ready to go into the biblical text itself. As we go into it, we want to make sure that we try to work carefully at understanding what claims it is actually making, because it's in the claims of the text that we find the authority of the text. If the claims that we end up identifying are just a matter of our interpretation that have plausible alternatives, or if it's a matter of imposing culture one across the other, those would have no authority. And so we have to make sure that we're seeing clearly what the text has to offer. So we're engaged then in text analysis. Now, I want to start, instead of starting in verse 1 and 2, let's start with day 1, starting in verse 3. Actually, let's start with verse 5. There it says that God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Question: why didn't God call the light light? Isn't that unusual that he called the light day? Well, it's strange because, of course, light isn't day, and day certainly sometimes is light. It often is, but why? What's going on? In fact, of course, we can make the adjustment easily enough because we look at it and we say, oh, okay, what is day? Day is a period of light. Okay, so God called a period of light day, and a period of darkness he called night. That makes sense, the names that he gave. Okay, naming, by the way, is a creative act in the ancient world, and to some extent in our world too. Naming is a creative act, and so in that sense, he's creating day and night. He's using the light as an instrument to do that, or a period of light. If we back up to verse 4, God separated the light and the darkness. Again, if we were thinking of this text as a physics text, that wouldn't get us very far. You can't separate light and darkness. They're not together. One is the absence of the other, and so that doesn't work real well. Okay? The light of the sun gets to us in 8 seconds. How long does it take the darkness to get to us? Never mind. Okay, so the idea of, well, what's going on in verse 4? Well, of course it works again. It's the period of light that's separated from a period of darkness. And the period of light is called day, and period of darkness night. Okay, fine. So in verse 5 it's a period of light. In verse 4 it's a period of light. Verse 3, let's be consistent, shall we? God said, let there be a period of light. Because after all, in verse 2 there was darkness. And what God is doing is calling a period of light into existence. And so a period of light, okay, is entered in, and distinguishing periods of light, periods of darkness, and the period of light he called day, and the period of darkness he called night. What that means is, what is being created on day 1? Besides day and night, it's the periods of light and darkness, periods of day and night, alternating. God created time. On day 1, God created time. There is no material object here. Light was not an object to them. We even have trouble with that when we learn physics. Okay, and darkness certainly is not an object. There is no object being brought into being here. God is rather setting up a function, the function of time. Now, with that observation, we're ready to go back to verse 1. In the beginning, God created. That word for create is the Hebrew verb bara, and we need to understand it on its own terms. We can't understand the text just on the basis of English. We have to understand it on the basis of Hebrew. So we take a look at this verb bara. It turns out it's used about 50 times in the Old Testament. That's how we figure out what words mean by how they're used. That's always true in our own language as well. There are about 50 occurrences. God is the only subject of that verb, so it's a divine activity. But what's more interesting is that it takes a wide variety of direct objects. You can find out a lot about a verb if you find out what the object of it is. So God created what? What are the kinds of things that God could create? It's an interesting list. We find out that God creates people groups. God creates Jerusalem. What kind of creation is creating Jerusalem? God creates phenomena like wind and fire and cloud and calamity and darkness. Those are not material objects. God creates abstractions like purity. Create in me a clean heart, a pure heart, O God. So God creates all sorts of objects that are not objects. They're not material. And we discover then that this verb bara is something different than a material manufacturing process. All of those things have to do with functions, with things working the way they ought to. And for God to get something working is a creative act. Now, bringing that information finally to verse 2, we find out that we're running right on the track with the author here. Again, remember, we're trying to figure out what story the author is telling. There are lots of different ways you could talk about origins. We've got one chapter here. What part of the origin story is God telling through this author to his audience? He's going to choose the part that, again, with his conventions, is most important for that context. We believe theologically that every aspect of origins was done by God. Material, functional, operations, everything was done by God. But which part of the story is the text telling? Now, part of that we can determine by where it starts and where it ends. Okay, and in verse 2 we find out that it starts not with zero matter, but with zero function. The formless and empty of verse 2. The sea is there already. It's not talking about the material origins of every aspect of the cosmos. It starts rather by describing a non-productive, non-functional situation that already has material in it. And so in that sense, darkness and sea in verse 2 are part of a non-ordered scenario in the ancient world. And the nouns that are used there talk about lacking worth or purpose, places where nothing is done, nothing is accomplished. The Egyptians have a parallel. They talk about the non-existent. And the non-existent could be the desert, could be the cosmic sea. To them that was non-existent because for them existence had more to do with operations and order and function than it had to do with material properties. And so for them to bring something into existence was a different sort of act than a manufacturing act that we tend to think about in our material ways of thinking. Now, my proposed thesis then is to say that in the Bible, the interest in origins is a functional interest. They want to focus on God setting up the world to work, to bring order to the world. Starts with non-order. That's Genesis 1:2. God's not going to change non-order into order. He's going to bring order into the midst of it. And that ordering process is what creating is. Think about even the way we use the word create in English. We could talk about creating a committee, creating a curriculum, creating a masterpiece. Those are ordering behaviors, ordering activities. And so the same thing is going on here, even though we're dealing with, of course, Hebrew, not English. So in our functional focus, existence is defined by having a function, a role and a purpose in an ordered system. That's what defined existence in the ancient world. It wasn't related to having a material structure. When the text talks about something being good, that's a statement about the functioning process. That is, it's ready to roll, it's ready to work. Think about the airline pilot in the cockpit before takeoff, going through the checklist. Ready to go, ready to go, ready to go. It was good, it was good, it was good. Okay, and we know that the text is using good that way because of something that's not good. It's not good for man to be alone. That's not ethical, that's not moral, that's not a design flaw. It's just not ready, quite ready to function yet. Genesis 1, then, I propose, contains an account of functional origins, the origins of the ordered cosmos, not an account of material origins. Genesis 1 is about God bringing order, functionality into the midst of non-order. Now, it's then fruitless to ask, what things did God create on any given day? Because the text is not concerned about the existence of matter. In this way of thinking, and it's true throughout the ancient world, in this way of thinking, naming and separating are acts of creation, because you separate something out by giving it a distinct role and a distinct purpose. Here's a way that you can think about it. We live in a residence of some sort, and we could think about that residence in terms of it being a house. It's got certain framing, certain siding, certain kind of roof, electricity, plumbing, certain kinds of floors. That's the house. We could also talk about the home. Which room is what? How's the furniture set up? How's the traffic pattern? How do we go about living here? How does this house function as our home? The house story and the home story are two different stories. And you could talk about how your residence began as a house, or you could talk about it how it began as your home. What I'm proposing is that in Genesis 1, we don't have the house story, we have the home story. And it's talking about how the house, which is the cosmos, became a home. And we'll talk about that a little more as we get further on in our discussions. When we think about the house story, which is what science explores, the house story of the cosmos, we find ourselves insignificant. That is, we are just one little bit in a large population. We're on a large planet where we're very small as an individual. The planet is a tiny speck in a solar system, which is a tiny speck in a galaxy, which is a tiny speck in an expanding universe. And the house story, we are insignificant. When we think of the home story, we are honored guests in God's home. Now, the function of Genesis 1, the first day, is time. The function of the second day is that God sets up weather to work. The function of the third day is God provides food. Again, in each of these situations, for instance, the dry land emerges. He says, let the plants sprout. He's talking about functions, again, not material manufacture. And in those first 3 days, time, weather, and food become the basic elements that make our environment. This is where we live. Every conversation that we have eventually comes back to time, weather, or food. Think about the conversations you might have in the grocery store or at the bus stop. Not so often quarks and molecules. Think of Genesis 8:22. As long as the earth endures, this is right after the flood, as long as the earth endures, what's going to be sustained? Seed time and harvest, that's food. Cold, heat, summer, winter, that's weather. Day and night, that's time, will never cease. This is how people thought in the ancient world. In days 1 through 3 then, the text is talking about the three most basic functions, and it's proclaiming those functions: the basis for time, the basis for weather, and the basis for food. In days 4 through 6, it's installing the functionaries. Sun, moon, and stars inhabit the area of time, and the birds and the fish and people. And especially as we get to the role of people, we are in the image of God. That addresses our function and our identity. It also addresses who we are as people. That is, that we are here to represent God, to be his stewards in his home. And so the image of God focuses on us not as a bunch of bones or a lot of atoms. It focuses on us as people who have a role in his place. And so that's the image of God that we need to understand from the text. That gives us an identity, and that's true of all of humanity. We all have an identity, and this describes that for us. And so as we think about Genesis 1, we have to think about it as the home story, not the house story, and try to understand it in that way. God is responsible as the builder of the house as well, but that's just not the story that it's telling, because that's not the one that's most important.